Chapter 26, Part 2 of The English Governess at the Siamese Court by Anna H. Leonowens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Supreme King, His Character and Administration, Part 2. That very night, without disorder or debate, the Senabawdi elected his eldest son, Somdetch Chowfa Chulalonkorn, to succeed him, and the Prince George Washington, eldest son of the late second king, to succeed to his father's subordinate throne, under the title of Kron Phra Raja Bovaun Shathan Mongkok. The title of the present Supreme King, my amiable and very promising scholar, is Prabat Somdetch Phra Paramendr Maha Chulalonkorn Kateklo Chow Yu Hua. About a year after my first ill-omened interviews with Maha Mongkut, and when I had become permanently installed in my double office of teacher and scribe, I was one day busy with a letter from His Majesty to the Earl of Clarendon, and finding that any attempt at partial correction would but render his meaning more ambiguous, and impair the striking originality of his style, I had abandoned the effort, and set about copying it with literal exactness, only venturing to alter here and there a word, such as "I hasten with wilful pleasure to write in reply to your lordship's well-wishing letter," etc. Whilst I was thus involving, with from the depths of my inner consciousness, a satisfactory solution to this conundrum in King's English, His Majesty's private secretary lolled in the sunniest corner of the room, stretching his dusky limbs and heavily nodding, in an ecstasy of ease-taking. Poor Phra Alak! I never knew him to be otherwise than sleepy, and his sleep was always stolen. For His Majesty was the most capricious of kings as to his working moods, busy when the average man should be sleeping, sleeping while letters, papers, dispatches, messengers, mail-boats waited. More than once had we been aroused at dead of night by noisy female slaves, and dragged in hot haste and consternation to the hall of audience, only to find that His Majesty was, not at his last gasp as we had feared, but simply bothered to find in Webster's dictionary some word that was to be nowhere but in his own fertile brain, or perhaps in excited chase of the classical term for some trifle he was on the point of ordering from London, and that word was sure to be a stranger to my brain. Before my arrival in Bangkok it had been his not uncommon practice to send for a missionary at midnight, have him beguiled or abducted from his bed, and conveyed by boat to the palace, some miles up the river, to inquire if it would not be more elegant to write murky instead of obscure, or gloomily dark rather than not clearly apparent. And if the wretched man should venture to declare his honest preference for the ordinary over the extraordinary form of expression, he was forthwith dismissed with irony, arrogance, or even insult, and without a word of apology for the rude invasion of his rest. One night, a little after 12 o'clock, as he was on the point of going to bed like any plain citizen of regular habits, His Majesty fell to thinking how most accurately to render into English the troublesome Siamese word "fee," which admits of a variety of interpretations. Footnote: ghost, spirit, soul, devil, evil angel. End of footnote. After puzzling over it for more than an hour, getting himself possessed with the word as with the devil it stands for, and all to no purpose, he ordered one of his lesser state barges to be manned, and dispatched with all speed for the British consul. That functionary, inspired with lively alarm by so startling a summons, dressed himself with unceremonious celerity, and hurried to the palace, conjecturing on the way all imaginable possibilities of politics and diplomacy, revolution or invasion. To his vexation, not less than his surprise, he found the king in dishabille, engaged with the Siamese English vocabulary, and mentally divided between Deuce and Devil, in the choice of an equivalent. His preposterous Majesty gravely laid the case before the consul, who, though inwardly chafing at what he termed the confounded coolness of the situation, had no choice but to decide with grace, and go back to bed with philosophy. No wonder, then, that P'hra Alâck experienced an excess of gratitude for the privilege of napping for 2 hours in a snuggery of sunshine. Mam Kha, (Footnote Kha, your slave.) He murmured drowsily, I hope that in the Chat Na (Footnote, the next state of existence.) I shall be a freed man. I hope so sincerely, P'hra Alâck, said I. I hope you'll be an Englishman or an American, for then you'll be sure to be independent. It was impossible not to pity the poor old man, stiff with continual stooping to his task, and so subdued, liable not only to be called at any hour of the day or night, but to be threatened, cuffed, kicked, beaten on the head, (Footnote, the greatest indignity a Siamese can suffer,) every way abused and insulted, and the next moment to be taken into favour, confidence, bosom friendship, even as his Majesty's mood might veer. Alack for P'hra Alâck! Though usually he bore with equal patience his greater and his lesser ills, there were occasions that sharply tried his meekness, when his weak and goaded nature revolted, and he rushed to a snug little home of his own, about 40 yards from the Grand Palace, there to snatch a respite of rest and refreshment in the society of his young and lately wedded wife. Then the king would awake and send for him, whereupon he would be suddenly ill or not at home, strategically hiding himself under a mountain of bedclothes, and detailing Mrs. P'hra Alâck to reconnoitre and report. He had tried this primitive trick so often that its very staleness infuriated the king, who invariably sent officers to seize the trembling accomplice and lock her up in a dismal cell as a hostage for the scribe's appearance. At dusk the poor fellow would emerge, contrite and terrified, and prostrate himself at the gate of the palace. Then his Majesty, who, having spies posted in every quarter of the town, knew as well as P'hra Alâck himself what the illness or the absence signified, leisurely strode forth, and finding the patient on the threshold, flew always into a genuine rage, and prescribed decapitation on the spot, and 60 lashes on the bare back, both in the same breath. And while the attendants flew right and left, one for the blade, another for the thong, the king, still raging, seized whatever came most handy, and belaboured his bosom friend on the head and shoulders. Having thus summarily relieved his mind, he dispatched the royal secretary for his ink, horn, and papyrus, and began inditing letters, orders, appointments, before scimitar or lash, which were ever tenderly slow on these occasions, had made its appearance. Perhaps in the very thick of his dictating he would remember the connubial accomplice, and order his people to release her and let her go. Slavery in Siam is the lot of men of much finer intellectual type than any who have been its victims in modern times in societies farther west. P'hra Alâck had been his Majesty's slave when they were boys together. Together they had played, studied, and entered the priesthood. At once bondman, comrade, classmate, and confidant, he was the very man to fill the office of private secretary to his royal crony. Virgil made a slave of his poet, and Horace was the son of an emancipated slave. The Roman leech and chirurgeon were often slaves. So too the preceptor and the pedagogue, the reader and the player, the clerk and the amanuensis, the singer, the dancer, the wrestler and the buffon, the architect, the smith, the weaver, and the shoemaker, even the armiger or squire, was a slave. Educated slaves exercised their talents and pursued their callings from the emolument of their masters, and thus it is today in Siam. Mutato nomine de te fabula narratur, P'hra Alâck. The king's taste for English composition had by much exercise developed itself into a passion. In the pursuit of it he was indefatigable, rambling, and petulant. He had Webster's unabridged on the brain, and exasperating form of King's Evil. The little dingy slips that emanated freely from the palace press were as indiscriminate as they were quaint. No topic was too sublime or too ignoble for them. All was copy that came to those cases, from the glory of the heavenly bodies to the nuisance of the busybodies who scolded His Majesty through the columns of the Bangkok Recorder. I have before me, as I write, a circular from his pen, and in the type of his private press, which being without caption or signature, may be supposed to be addressed to all whom it may concern. The American missionaries had vexed his exact scholarship by their peculiar mode of representing in English letters the name of a native city, Pripri, or in Sanskrit Bejrepuri. Whence this droll circular, which begins with the dogmatic line: "None should write the name of city of Pripri thus, P'et Cha Puri." Then comes a pedantic demonstration of the derivation of the name from the compound Sanskrit word signifying Diamond City, and the document concludes with a characteristic explosion of impatience, at once critical, royal, and anecdotal. Ah, what the romanization of American system that Pech Abury will be! Will whole human learned world become the pupil of their corrupted Siamese teachers? It is very far from correctness. Why they did not look in Journal of Royal Asiatic Society, where several words of Sanskrit and Pali were published continually. Their Siamese priestly teachers considered all Europeans as very heathen, to them far from sacred tongue, and were glad to have American heathens to become their scholars or pupils. They thought they have taught sacred language to the part of heathen. In fact, they themselves are very far from sacred language, being sunk deeply in corruption of sacred and learned language, for tongue of their former Laos and Cambodian teachers, and very far from knowledge of Hindustani, Singhalese, and Royal Asiatic Society's knowledge in Sanskrit, as they are considered by such the Siamese teachers as heathen, called by them mitcha ti, etc., etc., wrongly seer or spectator, etc., etc. In another slip, which is manifestly an outburst of the royal petulance, His Majesty demands, in a displayed paragraph: "Why name of Mr. Knox, Thomas George Knox, Esquire, British Consul, was not published thus, Miss Nok or Nafk, if name of Chow Phya Budha Rabhai is to be thus, Praya Pu Ta Rabhi? And why the London was not published thus, Lundun or London, if Bejrepuri is to be published Pech Aburi?" In the same slip with the philological protest the following remarkable paragraphs appear. What has been published in number 25 of Bangkok Recorder thus: "The King of Siam, on reading from some European paper that the Pope had lately suffered the loss of some precious jewels, in consequence of a thief having got possession of His Holiness' keys, exclaimed, 'What a man! Professing to keep the keys of heaven, and cannot even keep his own keys.' The king on perusal thereof denied that it is false. He knows nothing about His Holiness the Pope's sustaining loss of gems, etc., and has said nothing about religious faith." This is curious, in that it exposes the king's unworthy fear of the French priesthood in Siam. The fact is that he did make the rather smart remark in precisely these words: "Ah, what a man! Professing to keep the keys of heaven, and not able to guard those of his own bureau." And he was quite proud of his hit. But when it appeared in the Recorder, he thought it prudent to bar it with a formal denial. Hence the politic little item which he sent to all the foreigners in Bangkok, and especially to the French priests. His Majesty's mode of dealing with newspaper strictures, not always just, and suggestions, not always pertinent, aimed at his administration of public affairs, or the constitution and discipline of his household, was characteristic. He snubbed them with sententious arrogance, leavened with sarcasm. When the Recorder recommended to the king the expediency of dispersing his Solomonic harem, and abolishing polygamy in the royal family, his Majesty retorted with a verbal message to the editor, to the purport that, when the recorder shall have dissuaded princes and noblemen from offering their daughters to the king as concubines, the king will cease to receive contributions of women in that capacity. In August 1865, an angry altercation occurred in the Royal Court of Equity, sometimes styled the International Court, between a French priest and Fiaviset, a Siamese nobleman, of venerable years, but positive spirit and energy. The priest gave Fiaviset the lie, and Fiaviset gave it back to the priest, whereupon the priest became noisy. Afterward he reported the affair to his council at Bangkok, with the embellishing statement that not only himself but his religion had been grossly insulted. The consul, one Monsieur Aubaret, a peppery and pugnacious Frenchman, immediately made a demand upon his Majesty for the removal of Fiaviset from office. This dispatch was sent late in the evening by the hand of Monsieur Lamarche, commanding the troops at the royal palace, and that officer had the consul's order to present it summarily. Lamarche managed to procure admittance to the penetralia, and presented the note at 2 o'clock in the morning, in violation of reason and courtesy as well as of rules, excusing himself on the ground that the dispatch was important and his orders peremptory. His Majesty then read the dispatch, and remarked that the matter should be disposed of tomorrow. Lamarche replied very presumptuously that the affair required no investigation, as he had heard the offensive language of Fiaviset, and that person must be deposed without ceremony. Whereupon his Majesty ordered the offensive foreigner to leave the palace. Lamarche repaired forthwith to the council, and reported that the king had spoken disrespectfully, not only of his Imperial Majesty's consul, but of the emperor himself, besides outrageously insulting a French messenger. Then the fire-eating functionary addressed another dispatch to his Majesty, the purport of which was, that, in expelling Lamarche from the palace, the King of Siam had been guilty of a political misdemeanour, and had rudely disturbed the friendly relations existing between France and Siam; that he should leave Bangkok for Paris, and in 6 weeks lay his grievance before the emperor, but should first proceed to Saigon, and engage the French admiral there to attend to any emergency that might arise in Bangkok. His Majesty, who knew how to confront the uproar of vulgarity and folly with the repose of wisdom and dignity, sent his own cousin, the Prince Momrohide, chief judge of the Royal Court of Equity, to M. Aubaret, to disabuse his mind, and impart to him all the truth of the case. But the furious Frank seized the imposing magnate by the hair, drove him from his door, and flung his betel-box after him, a reckless impulse of outrage as monstrous as the most ingenious and deliberate brutality could have devised. Rudely to seize a Siamese by the hair is an indignity as grave as to spit in the face of a European, and the betel-box, beside being a royal present, was an essential part of the insignia of the prince's judicial office. On a later occasion this same Aubaret seized the opportunity a royal procession afforded to provoke the king to an ill-timed discussion of politics, and to prefer an intemperate complaint against the Kralahome, or prime minister. This characteristic flourish of ill temper and bad manners from the representative of the politest of nations naturally excited lively indignation and disgust among all respectable dwellers, native or foreign, near the court, and a serious disturbance was imminent. But a single dose of the king's English sufficed to soothe the spasmodic official, and reduce him to a sense of his situation. To the honoured Monseigneur Aubaret, the consul for his Majesty. Sir, the verbal insult or bad words without any step more over from lower or lowest person is considered very slight and inconsiderable. The person, standing on the surface of the ground or floor, cannot injure the heavenly bodies or any highly hanging lamp or globe by ejecting his spit from his mouth upward, it will only injure his own face without attempting of heavenly bodies, etc. The Siamese are knowing of being lower than heaven do not endeavour to injure heavenly bodies with their spit from mouth. A person who is known to be powerless by every one, as they who have no arms or legs to move, oppose, or injure, or deaf or blind, etc., etc., cannot be considered and said that they are our enemies, even for their madness in vain. It might be considered as easily agitation or uneasiness. Persons under strong desires, without any limit, or acting under illimited anger, sometimes cannot be believed at once without testimony or witness, if they stated against any one verbally from such the statements of the most desirous or persons most illimitedly angry, hesitation and mild enquiry is very prudent from persons of considerable rank. No signature. Never were simplicity with shrewdness, and unconscious humour with pathos, and candour with irony, and political economy with the sense of an awful bore, more quaintly blended than in the following extraordinary hint, written and printed by his Majesty, and freely distributed for the snubbing of visionary or speculative adventurers. Notice. When the general rumour was and is spread out from Siam, circulated among the foreigners to Siam, chiefly Europeans, Chinese, etc., in 3 points. First, that Siam is under quite absolute monarchy. Whatever her supreme sovereign commanded, allowed, etc., all cannot be resisted by any one of his subjects. Second, the treasury of the sovereign of Siam was full for money, like a mountain of gold and silver, her sovereign most wealthy. 3. The present reigning monarch of Siam is shallow-minded and admirer of almost everything of curiosity, and most admirer of European usages, customs, sciences, arts, and literature, etc., without limit. He is fond of flattering term and ambitious of honour, so that there are no many opportunities and operations to be embraced for drawing great money from royal treasury of Siam, etc. The most many foreigners being under belief of such general rumour, were endeavouring to draw money from him in various operations, as aiming him with valuable curiosities and expectations of interest, and flattering him to be glad of them, and deceiving him in various ways. Almost on every opportunity of steamer coming to Siam, various foreigners partly known to him, and acquainted with him, and generally unknown to him, boldly wrote to him in such the term of various application and treatment, so that he can conclude that the chief object of all letters written to him is generally to draw money from him, even unreasonable. Several instances and testimonies can be shown for being example on this subject. The foreigners' letters addressed to him come by every one steamer of Siam, and of foreign steamers visiting Siam, 10 and 12 at least, and 40 at highest number, urging him in various ways, so he concluded that foreigners must consider him only as a mad king of a wild land. He now states that he cannot be so mad more, as he knows and observes the consideration of the foreigners towards him. Also he now became of old age, (Footnote: He was 62 at this time.) And was very sorry to lose his principal members of his family, namely, his 2 queens, twice, and his younger brother, the late second king, and his late second son and beloved daughter, and moreover, now he fear of sickness of his eldest son. He is now unhappy, and must solicit his friends in correspondence, and others who please to write for the foresaid purpose, that they should know suitable reason in writing to him, and shall not urge him as they would urge a madman. And the general rumours forementioned are some exaggerated and some entirely false. They shall not believe such the rumours deeply and ascertainedly. Royal Residence, Grand Palace, Bangkok, 2nd July, 1867. And now observe this, what gracious ease this most astute and discriminating prince could fit his tone to the sense of those who, familiar with his opinions, and reconciled to his temper and his ways, however peculiar, could reciprocate the catholicity of his sympathies, and appreciate his united efforts to flinch off that tenacious old man of the sea custom and extricate himself from the predicament of conflicting responsibilities. To these, on the Christian New Year's Day of 1867, he addressed this kindly greeting: S.P.P. M. Mongkut, called in Siamese Fra Chomklao Chow Yuhua, in Magadhi or language of Pali, Siamikanam Maharaja, in Latin Rex Siamensium, in French Le Roi de Siam, in English the King of Siam, and in Malayan Raja Mahapasach, etc., begs to present his respectful and regardful compliments and congratulations in happy lives during immediately last year, and wishes the continuing thereof during the commencing new year, and ensuing and succeeding merry years, to his foreign friends, both now in Siam, namely, the functionary and acting consuls and consular officers of various distinguished nations in treaty power with Siam, and certain foreign persons under our salary, in service in any manner here, and several gentlemen and ladies who are resident in Siam in various stations, namely, the priests, preachers of religion, masters and mistresses of schools, workmen and merchants, etc., and now abroad in various foreign countries and ports, who are our noble and common friends, acquainted either by ever having had correspondences mutually with us some time, at anywhere, and remaining in our friendly remembrance or mutual remembrance, and whosoever are in service to us, as our consuls, vice-consuls, and consular assistants in various foreign ports, let them know our remembrance and good wishes towards them all. Though we are not Christians, the forenamed king was glad to arrive this day in his valued life, as being the 27,720th day of his age, during which he was aged 62 years and 3 months, and being the 5,711th day of his reign, during which he reigned upon his kingdom 15 years and 8 months up to the current month. In like manner he was very glad to see and know and hope for all his royal family, kindred and friends of both native and foreign, living near and far to him, had arrived to this very remarkable anniversary of the commencement of solar year in Anno Christi 1867. In their all being healthy and well living like himself, he begs to express his royal congratulation and respect and graceful regards to all his kindred friends both native and foreign, and hopes to receive such the congratulation and expression of good wishes toward him and members of his family in very like manner, as he trusts that the amity and grace to one another of every of human beings who are innocent is a great merit, and is righteous and praiseworthy in religious system of all civil religion, and best civilized laws and morality, etc. Given at the Royal Audience Hall, Anand Samagom, Grand Palace, Bangkok, etc., etc. The remoter provinces of Siam constitute a source of continual anxiety and much expense to the government, and to his Majesty, who, very conscious of power, was proud to be able to say that the Malayan territories and rajas, Cambodia, with her marvellous cities, palaces, and temples, once the stronghold of Siam's most formidable and implacable foes, the Laos country, with its warlike princes and chiefs, were alike dependencies and tributaries of his crown. It was intolerably irritating to find Cambodia rebellious. So long as his government could successfully maintain its supremacy here, that country formed a sort of neutral ground between his people and the Cochin Chinese, a geographical condition which was not without its political advantages. But now the unscrupulous French had strutted upon the scene, and with a flourish of diplomacy and a stroke of the pen appropriated to themselves the fairest portion of that most fertile province. His Majesty, though secretly longing for the intervention and protection of England, was deterred by his almost superstitious fear of the French from complaining openly; but whenever he was more than commonly annoyed by the pretensions and aggressive epistles of his Imperial Majesty's consul, he sent for me, thinking, like all Orientals, that being English, my sympathy for him and my hatred of the French were jointly a foregone conclusion. When I would have assured him that I was utterly powerless to help him, he cut me short with a wise whisper, to consult Mr. Thomas George Knox; and when I protested that that gentleman was too honourable to engage in a secret intrigue against a colleague, even for the protection of British interests in Siam, he would rave at my indifference, the cupidity of the French, the apathy of the English, and the fatuity of all geographers in setting down the form of government in Siam as an absolute monarchy. I, an absolute monarch, for I have no power over French. Siam is like a mouse before an elephant. Am I an absolute monarch? What shall you consider me? Now as I considered him a particularly absolute and despotic king, that was a trying question, so I discreetly held my peace, fearing less to be classed with those obnoxious savants who compile geographies than to provoke him afresh. I have no power, he scolded. I am not absolute. If I point the end of my walking stick at a man whom, being my enemy, I wish to die, he does not die but lives on, in spite of my absolute will to the contrary. What does geographies mean? How can I be an absolute monarchy? Such a conversation we were having one day, as he assisted at the founding of a temple, and while he reproached his fate that he was powerless to point the end of his walking stick, with absolute power at the peppery and presumptuous Monsieur Aubaret, he vacantly flung gold and silver coins among the workmen. In another moment he forgot all French encroachments, and the imbecility of geographers in general, as his glance chanced to fall upon a young woman of fresh and striking beauty, and delightful piquancy of ways and expression, who with a clumsy club was pounding fragments of pottery, urns, vases, and goglets, for the foundation of the vat. Very artless and happy she seemed, and free as she was lovely, but the instant she perceived she had attracted the notice of the king, she sank down and hid her face in the earth, forgetting or disregarding the falling vessels that threatened to crush or wound her. But the king merely diverted himself with inquiring her name and parentage, and some one answering for her, he turned away. Almost to the latest hour of his life his Majesty suffered, in his morbid egoism, various and keen annoyance, by reason of his sensitiveness to the opinions of foreigners, the encroachments of foreign officials, and the strictures of the foreign press. He was agitated by a restless craving for their sympathy on the one hand, and by a futile resentment of their criticisms or their claims on the other. An article in a Singapore paper had administered moral correction to his Majesty on the strength of a rumour that the king has his eye upon another princess of the highest rank, with a view to constituting her a queen consort. And the Bangkok recorder had said, now considering that he is full 63 years of age, that he has already scores of concubines and about 80 sons and daughters, with several chowfas among them, and hence eligible to the highest post of honour in the kingdom, this rumour seems too monstrous to be credited. But the truth is, there is scarcely anything too monstrous for the royal polygamy of Siam to bring forth. By the light of this explanation, the meaning of the following extract from the postscript of a letter which the king wrote in April 1866 will be clear to the reader, who, at the same time, in justice to me, will remember that by the death of his Majesty, on the 1st of October 1868, the seal of secrecy was broken. Very private postscript. There is a newspaper of Singapore entitled Daily News, just published after last arrival of the steamer Chopfia in Singapore, in which paper a correspondence from an individual resident at Bangkok, dated 16th March 1866, was shown, but I have none of that paper in my possession. I did not notice its number and date to state to you now, but I trust such the paper must be in hand of several foreigners in Bangkok. May you have read it perhaps? Otherwise you can obtain the same from any one or by order to obtain from Singapore. After perusal thereof you will not be able to deny my statement forementioned. Moreover, as general people, both native and foreigners here seem to have less pleasure on me and my descendant than their pleasure and hope on other amiable family to them until the present day. What was said there, in for a princess considered by the speaker or writer as proper or suitable to be head of my harem, a room or part for confinement of women of Eastern monarch. [Footnote: A parenthetical drollery inspired by the dictionary. There is no least intention occurred to me, even once or in my dreams indeed. I think if I do so, I will die soon perhaps. This my handwriting, or content hereof, shall be kept secretly. I beg to remain, your faithful well-wisher, S.P.P. M. Moncott, E.S. On 5441st day of reign. The writer here of beg to place his confidence on you always. As a true friend to his Majesty, I deplore the weakness which betrayed him into so transparent a sham of virtuous indignation. The princess of the highest rank, whom the writer of the article plainly meant, was the Princess of Chiengmai, but from lack of accurate information he was misled into confounding her with the Princess Tui Duang Prava, his Majesty's niece. The king could honestly deny any such intention on his part with regard to his niece, but at the same time he well knew that the writer erred only as to the individual, and not as to the main fact of the case. The Princess of Chiengmai was the wife, and the Princess Tui Duang the daughter, of his full brother, the second king, lately deceased. Much more agreeable it is, to the reader I doubt not less than to the writer, to turn from the king, in the exercise of his slavish function of training honest words, to play the hypocrite for ignoble thoughts, to the gentleman, the friend, the father, giving his heart a holiday in the relaxations of simple kindness and free affection, as in the following note. Dated Rancho Puri, 14th February, 1865. To Lady L., her son Louis, Bangkok. We having very pleasant journey, to be here, which is a township called as above named by men of republic affairs in Siam, and called by common people as Park Freak, where we have our stay a few days, and will take our departure from hence at dawn of next day. We thinking of you both regardfully, and beg to send here with some wild apples and berries, which are delicate for tasting, and some tobacco, which were and are principal product of this region, for your kind acceptance, hoping this wild present will be acceptable to you both. We will be arrived at our home Bangkok on early part of March. We beg to remain, your faithful S.P.P. M. Moncott, E.S. in 5035th day of reign, and your affectionate pupils, Jing Ju Lax, Mane Ab Thandahorn, Somdech Chofa, Chulalonkorn, footnote the present king, end of footnote, Kritahinihar, Prabhasor Somavati. End of chapter 26.